In the grand hallways of the Jefferson County Courthouse, the old clock struck 9, its deep resonance echoing through the marble corridors. Judge Samuel Turner, a man of 58, adjusted his black robe and polished his round glasses, preparing for another day of what he called justice. Known for his ruthless efficiency and sharp tongue, Judge Turner was not one to suffer fools lightly. "Next case," he called, his voice booming through the courtroom. The air was thick with anticipation as the gallery braced for the next defendant. Case number 47629, State vs. Frank Thompson. Charge, criminal trespassing, 3rd degree. The courtroom doors swung open, and all eyes turned to the elderly man shuffling forward. Frank Thompson, in his mid-70s, wore a faded plaid shirt that hung loosely on his thin frame. His blue jeans were frayed at the cuffs, and his scuffed boots told a story of hard work. A baseball cap adorned his white hair, which he removed respectfully as he approached the defendant's table. Judge Turner's eyes narrowed, scrutinizing the man before him. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice dripping with disdain, "you were caught trespassing on the grounds of the Maplewood estate. Care to explain yourself?" Frank looked up, his bright blue eyes surprisingly clear. "Yes, Your Honor. I was just sitting by the lake. I used to fish there as a boy." The judge flipped through the case file, feigning annoyance. "It says here this is your second offense for trespassing in the last 6 months. The previous incident was at the Greenfield Country Club." "That's correct, Your Honor," Frank replied, his tone steady despite the tension in the room. "They have a beautiful garden there." A few chuckles erupted from the gallery, quickly silenced by the judge's glare. "Do you find this amusing, Mr. Thompson?" Judge Turner's voice dropped dangerously low. "You're wasting valuable time that could be spent on serious matters." Frank stood quietly, hands folded in front of him, seemingly unfazed by the judge's growing frustration. "Where is your attorney, Mr. Thompson?" Judge Turner asked, scanning the courtroom. "I don't have one, Your Honor," Frank replied simply. "Of course you don't," the judge snapped, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Let me guess, you couldn't afford one?" "I chose not to hire one for today's hearing," Frank said. Judge Turner's eyebrows shot up. "You chose not to? Do you understand the charge against you? That repeated offenses could result in jail time?" "I understand the law quite well, Your Honor," Frank said, his voice unwavering. Something about the old man's calm demeanor seemed to aggravate the judge further. "I see. A legal expert, are we? Tell me, Mr. Thompson, if you understand the law so well, why do you insist on breaking it?" "I don't believe I was harming anyone, Your Honor," Frank replied. "That's not for you to decide." Judge Turner's voice boomed, causing a few spectators to flinch. "The law isn't a buffet where you pick and choose which parts to follow based on your personal feelings." Assistant District Attorney Lisa Chen, seated at the prosecution table, shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Turner continued, leaning forward, "I'm curious, what do you do for a living? Or are you retired?" "I keep myself occupied with various interests, Your Honor," Frank answered. "Various interests?" Judge Turner scoffed. "And these interests include trespassing on private property and wasting the court's time?" "I apologize for any inconvenience I've caused the court," Frank said, his tone sincere. "Inconvenience?" Judge Turner echoed, his voice rising again. "Mr. Thompson, it costs thousands of taxpayer dollars to process even minor cases like yours. Do you understand that money could be spent on schools, roads, or public services instead of dealing with people like you?" Frank absorbed the verbal lashing without visible reaction, which seemed to further fuel the judge's indignation. What possesses a man of your age to engage in such behavior? Is it boredom? A misguided sense of entitlement? Or perhaps you're seeking attention? A young public defender, sitting in the gallery, shifted uncomfortably, her expression troubled by the judge's treatment of Frank. "Your Honor," Frank began, but Judge Turner cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Save it, Mr. Thompson. I've heard every excuse imaginable during my time on this bench." The judge adjusted his glasses again, a familiar gesture to regular courtroom attendees, signaling the start of one of his infamous lectures. "When I was growing up, men of your generation taught us about responsibility, hard work, and respect for property and the law." Frank's expression remained unchanged, though a glimmer of amusement flickered in his eyes. "Look at yourself," Judge Turner continued, gesturing at Frank's worn clothing. "Is this how you want to present yourself to the world? There are resources available, shelters that provide decent clothing, social services that can help men in your situation." "You assume much about me, Your Honor," Frank said quietly. "I assume nothing. I observe," Judge Turner retorted. "And what I observe is a man who has clearly made a series of poor life choices and now expects society to accommodate his disregard for private property and the law." The courtroom had grown increasingly uncomfortable. "You know, Mr. Thompson," Judge Turner continued, "this court sees real hardship every day, people who are genuinely struggling, who made mistakes but are trying to better themselves. And then we have individuals like yourself who seem to take pride in being a nuisance." Frank replied calmly, "I don't take pride in breaking the law, Your Honor." "Then explain to me why you're back here again for essentially the same offense. Why couldn't you simply find a public park to visit instead of trespassing? Are the public facilities not good enough for you?" "The Maplewood estate holds special memories for me, Your Honor. My father worked there as a groundskeeper when I was a boy. We would fish together in that lake every Sunday." For a moment, uncertainty flickered across Judge Turner's face, but it was quickly replaced by his customary stern expression. "Nostalgia is not a legal defense, Mr. Thompson. The property has changed hands multiple times since then. It's now privately owned by people who have the right to enjoy it without uninvited visitors." "I understand that, Your Honor," Frank nodded. Judge Turner studied him for a moment longer, then shook his head in disgust. "Perhaps a more severe penalty will help the message sink in." He began flipping through the case file, muttering about repeat offenders and wasting the court's time. "Given your prior offense and your evident lack of remorse or understanding of the seriousness of your actions, I'm inclined to sentence you to 30 days in county jail. Perhaps that will give you time to reflect on your behavior and the importance of respecting other people's property rights." A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom, even Lisa looked startled. "Your Honor," she interjected, "the state was prepared to recommend community service given the nonviolent nature of the offense and Mr. Thompson's age." Judge Turner fixed her with a cold stare. "Thank you for your input, but I believe I'm still the one wearing the robe in this courtroom." Frank's expression changed, not to fear or anger, but to mild surprise. "Your Honor," he said, his voice suddenly stronger, "before you pass sentence, might I ask permission to make a phone call?" "A phone call?" Judge Turner scoffed. "This isn't a police procedural, Mr. Thompson. You should have made any necessary calls before appearing in my courtroom." "It will only take a moment," Frank insisted. "I'd like to call my daughter. She should be informed if I'm to spend 30 days in jail." The judge rolled his eyes. "Fine, bailiff, allow Mr. Thompson to make his call. Let's not deny him a phone call to any complaints he might file later." The sarcasm was thick. Bailiff Rodriguez approached Frank with a cell phone. The old man thanked him with a genuine smile. Frank dialed a number from memory, and the courtroom fell silent, curious about this unexpected development. After a brief moment, he spoke into the phone, his voice clear and precise. "It's time," he said, handing the phone back to the bailiff with another thank you, turning to face the judge again, standing a little straighter than before. Judge Turner's expression was a mixture of impatience and puzzlement. "Well, that was cryptic. Are we supposed to?" The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, interrupting the judge mid-sentence. All heads turned as a striking woman in her 40s strode purposefully down the center aisle, dressed in a tailored charcoal gray suit and red designer shoes. Her dark hair was pulled back, highlighting sharp cheekbones and eyes that matched the exact shade of blue as Frank's. "Your Honor, I have very specific business with this case," she interrupted, her voice authoritative as she approached the barrier separating the gallery from the court. The bailiff moved uncertainly, looking to the judge for direction. Judge Turner, momentarily flustered, gave a small nod. The woman passed through the gate and walked directly to Frank, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Dad," she said, her tone protective. "Catherine," Frank replied, a hint of relief in his voice. I'm here regarding my father, Frank Thompson, whom you've been publicly humiliating for the past 20 minutes. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Turner's face, flushed with righteous indignation moments before, now paled visibly. Miss Thompson, this is most irregular. Court procedures dictate. I'm well aware of court procedures, Judge Turner, Catherine interrupted smoothly. Just as I'm aware of the judicial code of conduct that prohibits bias and the degradation of defendants based on perceived socioeconomic status. All of which have been on grotesque display in your courtroom today. One of the attorneys accompanying Catherine stepped forward, placing a thick leather folio on the defense table. Your Honor, he said, the documents you requested. Catherine nodded her thanks without taking her eyes off the judge. Perhaps you'd care to review these materials before continuing with your assessment of my father? Judge Turner looked from Catherine to Frank and then to the leather folio, his demeanor shifting dramatically. Gone was the imperious tyrant, replaced by a man suddenly aware he might be standing on quicksand. The court will take a 15-minute recess, he announced abruptly, his voice lacking its previous authority. I don't believe that will be necessary, Catherine replied, her tone unyielding. Unless you need time to compose yourself after realizing you've spent the morning publicly berating one of the state's most respected businessmen. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder as Judge Turner's face drained of color. Mr. Thompson, he began, his voice trembling. I had no idea who you were. If I had known. That's precisely the problem, Catherine cut him off. Your treatment would have been different had you known who he really is. Frank, now standing tall beside his daughter, addressed the courtroom. For those who don't recognize my name, I founded Thompson Technologies 45 years ago. I hold multiple patents and serve on the boards of several Fortune 500 companies. The courtroom fell silent in disbelief. You see, twice a year for the past decade, I've conducted social experiments. I dress in old clothes, remove all identification, and spend 2 weeks living as if I were someone of limited means, Frank explained. I ride public transportation, eat at soup kitchens, and yes, occasionally revisit places from my childhood, like the Maplewood estate. Judge Turner's mouth opened and closed, stunned. Why would you allow? To see how the system works for those without resources, Frank interjected. To experience firsthand what happens when justice is administered based on appearance rather than evidence. Catherine stepped forward. Today's exhibition of judicial misconduct certainly qualifies. As the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations, Judge Turner stood frozen, his authority shattered. Frank continued, the true measure of justice isn't how it treats the powerful, but how it treats the powerless. Lisa Chen, the assistant district attorney, finally spoke up. In light of these revelations, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Thompson immediately. Judge Turner barely managed a nod, his eyes still fixed on Frank, as if seeing him for the first time. Catherine handed a document to the bailiff. This is a notice of our intent to file a formal complaint with the Judicial Conduct Committee. The recording of today's proceedings will be submitted as evidence, along with statements from witnesses. Judge Turner's face turned ashen. I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. On the contrary, Frank replied. You saw an old man in worn clothes and assumed he was worthless. You used your power to humiliate someone you believed couldn't fight back. The gallery remained transfixed, their phones recording the unfolding drama. The question is, Frank continued, what will you do with that awareness? Catherine added, we want justice, Your Honor. The same thing everyone who enters this courtroom should expect, regardless of what they're wearing or how much money they have. Judge Turner, now visibly shaken, sat motionless behind his bench, the color continuing to drain from his face as the magnitude of his situation became clear. As Charles and Catherine prepared to leave, a young woman from the gallery approached them. Mr. Thompson, Miss Thompson, she said nervously, I'm Sarah Patel, a law student clerking for Judge Turner. I just wanted to say what you did here today was important. Why is that? Frank asked. Because this isn't unusual. This is how he treats defendants every day, especially those who can't afford private attorneys. But no one ever calls him on it because they don't have the power to. Thank you for your honesty, Miss Patel, Frank said gently. It takes courage to speak truth in the face of authority. As they turned to leave, the judge called out, "Mr. Thompson." His voice strained. It seems news of today's events has already reached social media. There are reporters gathering outside the courthouse. Frank exchanged a glance with Catherine. The power of technology, Your Honor. When I was a young man, news traveled at the speed of the evening paper. Now it travels at the speed of light. Catherine checked her phone and nodded. The courthouse steps are indeed quite crowded. Your Honor, Frank said, I'd like to make a proposal. Judge Turner straightened in his seat. I'm listening. Join us outside. Address the situation honestly. Acknowledge the problem and commit to being part of the solution. The judge looked stunned. You want me to face the press after what just happened? Precisely, Frank replied. Moments of public failure can become powerful catalysts for positive change if we have the courage to face them honestly. As they approached the courthouse steps, Judge Turner walked as if in a trance, his black robe no longer a symbol of authority but a weight dragging him down. Frank walked with the confident posture of a man accustomed to boardrooms, all traces of his earlier demeanor vanished. When they reached the doors, they were met with a wall of camera flashes and shouted questions. Mr. Thompson, is it true you're worth billions? Judge Turner, will you resign? Thank you all for coming, Frank began, his voice carrying easily. Today, I appeared in court dressed as you see me now, not because of necessity, but by choice. A murmur spread through the crowd as they connected the dots. What I experienced today in Courtroom 7 was unfortunately not unusual. Across this country, people are judged not by their character, but by their clothing. Judge Turner stood beside him, visibly uncomfortable, but Frank continued. Today also presents an opportunity for change. I've asked Judge Turner to join me, not because I demanded it, but because acknowledging our mistakes publicly is the first step toward meaningful change. Judge Turner cleared his throat, the crowd silent. What happened in my courtroom today was inexcusable. I failed to uphold the most basic principle of justice, that all who enter a courtroom deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. Frank nodded, his expression solemn. Acknowledgement is the first step toward change. I allowed prejudice to cloud my judgment, Judge Turner continued. I betrayed my oath as a judge. A hush fell over the crowd. I extend my sincere apology to Mr. Thompson and to every person who has stood before me and received less than the impartial justice they deserved. Frank smiled slightly. Thank you, Your Honor. This was never about you. It was about the thousands of people who enter courtrooms every day without the power to defend themselves against bias. The crowd buzzed with excitement as Judge Turner announced his intention to take a temporary leave of absence while cooperating with an investigation into his conduct. As the press conference continued, Frank gestured for Sarah Patel to join them. This is Sarah Patel, he introduced her. A law student who had the courage to speak truth to power. Charles noticed the change in the atmosphere as the reporters began to shift their focus. We will be establishing a new initiative, the Equal Justice Project, with an initial funding commitment of $50 million. As the press conference concluded, Frank turned to Judge Turner. Thank you for your honesty. It takes courage to acknowledge our faults. With the world watching, Frank Thompson had transformed a moment of injustice into a powerful call for change, reminding everyone that true dignity is determined by how we treat one another, regardless of status.